transdisciplinary approach to problem solving in the classroom and in the community. The students and faculty within the SEEDS programs are intentional in seeking an understanding of the ecological, historical, ethical, and cultural contexts of environmental problems. As such, they have been wonderful supporters of efforts such as this, where we seek to highlight and solve the social dimensions of environmental issues. I also want to secondly thank Green Umbrella. Green Umbrella is a collaborative network of over 260 organizations and businesses in the greater Cincinnati area. The folks at Green Umbrella have become one of the most powerful forces for coordinating sustainability efforts, and they do this by engaging communities, equipping local leaders, co-designing solutions, and mobilizing resources to turn ideas into action and action into impact. They've been a wonderful partner for Pews, UC, and many other folks here, and we're grateful for them in their help in promoting this event. And then third, this event is also made possible by the generous support of the Brueggemann Center for Dialogue at Xavier University. Recognizing our current culture of cultural climate of division and polarization, the Brueggemann Center is committed to fostering dialogue. As a crucial form of interpersonal relating, dialogue is not simply a conversation, but an encounter between people built upon both a willingness to listen deeply and an openness to being transformed. The center continues, as it has in the past, to seek partners regionally, nationally, and globally to collaborate in the essential work of deepening interfaith understandings and promoting systemic change on issues of social and environmental justice. Their support for this event is an expression of that mission. And lastly, I'd like to take a moment to recognize UC's Center for Public Engagement with Science, who is the primary sponsor for this event. Pews is a multidisciplinary group of scholars and educators at UC who produce research and resources on philosophy of science, science education, and community engagement with science. Pews's activity and outputs are diverse. They include assisting UC's general sustainability efforts, sponsoring research, offering science communication workshops, publishing a book series on public engagement with science, and helping put on middle school science fairs, as well as advancing relevant coursework at UC and hosting speaker events such as this. Pews has many faculty affiliates, myself included, who benefit greatly from being part of this collaborative interdisciplinary group and also contribute via our unique areas of expertise. One of the main focus areas of Pews is sustainability, because we recognize that making systematic and lasting progress on these issues requires a bilateral, cooperative, and symbiotic relationship between science and the public. We'll hear much more about these challenges and solutions from our speaker today, and Pews is proud to be a supporter and participant in this work. So we have the privilege today of welcoming to UC a truly special scholar whose prolific record of work has already had an immense impact on how scientists understand environmental psychology, as well as on how activists and advocates design effective communication strategies. Dr. Matthew Goldberg is a faculty member and research scientist at the Yale School of the Environment and is the director of experimental research at the Yale Program on climate change communication. His academic work, which you'll hear a small fraction of today, studies how people think and act on environmental issues, as well as how we can design more effective communication strategies. With over 60 peer-reviewed publications and dozens of additional research reports, he has received the Rising Star Award from the Association for the Psychological Science, as well as the Early Career Achievement Award from the American Psychological Association. This work has been widely covered in the media, including in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time Magazine, NBC News, ABC News, The Guardian, CNN, and the LA Times, and you also may have caught him on NPR's Science Friday. In case that's not enough, in March of 2024, he ran 33 miles for his 33rd birthday, and from what he's told me, he's aiming for 34 for his 34th this spring. But most importantly, he is inspiring in his character, exemplifying the scientific virtues of humility, curiosity, and perseverance. Through his mentorship of students and his collaborations with his research partners, he's built a reputation of not only being a prolific researcher, but also a truly wonderful human. So on behalf of Pews and our other co-sponsors, it's our privilege to welcome Dr. Goldberg to the University of Cincinnati to share with us some of the findings from his work, lessons learned along the way, and tangible strategies that can help us as we try to move the needle on this important issue. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Matthew Goldberg.
All good? Testing. All right. Thanks so much, everybody. Thank you to our sponsors. So glad to be here. Thank you for the warm welcome. I was going to name this talk the Abel and Matt Academic Bromance, but I don't know if it would sell well. So I named it this. Hang on, this just fell over. All right, so let's get into it. That buzzing okay? All right. All right, so make sure this is right. All right. So yeah, excited to share some of our work with you all today. One of the big things that kind of centers all of our work is that huge issues like climate change, they have many great solutions, many great innovations that could help us mitigate it and adapt to climate change, but we lack the public and political will to address it. So we are driven by this idea that good ideas don't necessarily succeed on their merits, and there's a lot that we need to do to drive social change. So change hearts and minds among the American public and all around the world. And so I'll break this talk into three main parts. And this also will just give you a general idea of how I'm thinking about these kinds of things in our work. And so starting with number one, so as Abel mentioned, I lead the experimental research at the Yale Program on climate change communication. So this is looking at what can we do to move people in the right direction on this. And this first part of the talk is first just orienting ourselves to where we should even focus. So this is in identifying intervention points. Next, we'll focus on some of our attempts to change hearts and minds, and I'll highlight some success stories. And then lastly, we'll zoom out a bit and think about how we do this on a mass scale. There's so much progress that we need to make. And so I'll just do a little preview of the kinds of things we've been thinking about and how we can drive that progress. So first, identifying intervention points. This is based on this idea that even if we had all the power and resources in the world, we would still have to make strategic choices about where and how to spend it. Spoiler, we don't have all the power and resources in the world, so we got to be extra good with how we spend those resources and where we allocate them. And so first with the basics is tracking public opinion helps us identify intervention points. So this goes way back where the inception of our program in 2007, where we started in 2008, the Climate Change in the American Mind project. And since then, our program has gone all around the world. And so I'll show some of that today. And the reason why tracking public opinion is so important is because we need some barometer to compare ourselves to. Where are we making progress in people's basic acknowledgement of the issue, their understanding of its causes and impacts, and their desire to take action. And so over the past few years, we've collaborated with Data for Good and RARE to do these mass level surveys across over 190 countries and territories. And so just starting with basic knowledge about climate change, this is asking people what they know about climate change, and then the lowest response option being, I've never even heard of climate change. And so just a quick glance at the map shows that this level of perceived knowledge varies dramatically. And so when we do a deeper dive into any one of these countries, so we do a lot of work in India, for example, where more than a third of people report that they have not heard of climate change at all. And so this level of exposure and this depth with which we are in this conversation varies dramatically across countries, but also within countries. And so taking a look at the proportion of people across these countries that believe climate change is caused by human activities, which it is, we can see that barely any of these countries reach a majority. So the ones in blue are below 50%. And so this is a huge problem because if we aren't fully understanding what the causes of climate change are, then it's hard for us to know which things to do to help mitigate it. And this is super important because this underlies a lot of this basic understanding of the things we do, the food we eat, the car we drive, all these different decisions have a significant impact on our world. And so that's just the basics. There's so much depth that we could go into there. Climate change of the American mind is past its 30th wave of data collection, so we can spend all day just on the US. But I want to focus on this idea of intervention points a little bit more deeply here. So what makes a good intervention point? It's been pretty hard to define, so I just showed you some examples. We need to build knowledge and understanding that what we do affects the climate. But one thing that our team does, it's pre-intervention. So we are looking for places where it would be most strategic and useful to build action, to build understanding, to connect the dots for people, encourage people to interact with others. So one big one that we've found time and again is that there's this really large gap between worry about climate change and how often people talk about it. So what we find in the US, more or less every year, this fluctuates a little bit, but in general, we find that about 2 in 3 Americans are worried about climate change on some level. But at the same time, about 2 in 3 Americans say they rarely or never talk about climate change. And there are a bunch of reasons for this. And this is rooted in this idea of pluralistic ignorance, where we think others are not as concerned, so then we don't express ourselves and so on. And I want to get into why people don't talk about climate change. It boils down to 2 main reasons. There are a bunch of reasons, but there are 2 big ones that keep coming up in study after study. First one, as I was just saying, is that people underestimate how pro-climate others are. And I'll show you some data on that in a moment. And the other one is people think the conversation will be more unpleasant than it actually ends up being. So this idea of affective forecasting is when people imagine talking to someone else about climate change, they often think it's going to be a worse time than it actually ends up being. And so often when I am speaking to someone that I might disagree with on the issue, or we might have some different views on it, I'm often delightfully surprised and how well we could connect, especially in an in-person, trusting environment. And so this is pretty encouraging. So I want to zoom in a little bit on this first point, that people underestimate how pro-climate others are. We've done this in many, many studies, so I'm just showing you a quick snapshot. So in each of these bars on the left-hand side, we have the actual percentage of people that say climate change is happening, that they are worried about it, that we should regulate CO2 as a pollutant, and support for funding renewable research into renewable energy. So the left side is the actual proportion of people surveyed that chose yes or that they support on that thing. But the bar on the right is when we ask people, what do you think most Americans believe? And people can choose a percentage of where they're at, and we can take an average of that. And what we can see again and again is that across these different beliefs and policy support, that people consistently underestimate the level of support. And we can see that this effect is even larger for more popular things. And the reason why this is so important is because often we are scanning our environment for whether people disagree with us, how are they judging us, we're very concerned about social norms. And so this underestimation is a big deal in driving this hesitation to talk about climate change. And if none of us ever talk about it, then we're not connecting with others, we're not building efforts towards collective action. This is a really significant barrier, and it's an intervention point. And so there have been plenty of experiments now on correcting these misperceptions. And this can be applied to all across so many different issues, including climate and issues that are adjacent to it. But we find again and again that when we inform people that most others are worried about climate change, so the actual fact of what people are reporting, in this case in the US, they're much more likely to discuss it with others. And so often when that hesitation is lifted, we can start to connect more with one another. And so my background's in social psychology. One thing that I focused a lot on in my grad career is the role of close relationships. If we're going to move anyone on this issue, our best shot, I think, is people that are closest to us, where we already have trust and rapport, where we're not having to make that leap and build it from scratch, or get that trust through another means where we don't already have it in hand. And so one factor that we focused on is who's in the best position to talk to others about climate change, and what kind of opportunities do we have for that engagement. And so a long time ago, our team did a nationally representative survey of Americans, and they asked, who can convince you to take action to reduce climate change? And the number one kind of person is your significant other. And this makes sense. Often in close relationships research, significant others are among the closest people in our lives. And so this makes sense here. But you could see that other people in our lives are still quite highly rated. And so several years after, so just a few years ago in 2022, we actually sampled, we did a large sample of both partners in romantic couples. We surveyed about 800 romantic couples, and what was so powerful about this is that we can understand what they believe, each partner, but also what they think the other person believes. So let me lay this out for you a little bit. So you've got an individual, you walk around with your own beliefs and behaviors regarding climate change. You've got your partner that has their own beliefs about climate change. And that alone is a lot of interesting stuff going on. But you also have what you think your partner believes about climate change, and that may or may not reflect reality. And so when we surveyed this large number of couples, we first measured this idea of correspondence. So how much do their beliefs overlap? So we asked them the same survey, a bunch of different stuff about what they believe, what they're worried about regarding climate change, what kinds of actions they're taking, and we created a big index, and we measured correspondence. And this was, people are similar to one another in romantic relationships, but it wasn't nearly as high as we expected. So this level of correspondence was in the 30 to 40% range. So much more similar than pulling two random people off the street, but there's quite a big gap there where they're not fully overlapped there. And this is pretty surprising, is because there's a huge amount of research that we tend to seek out partners that are very much like us already. I'm guessing that most people aren't thinking about climate change when they're dating, but that's increasingly changed because this paper has gotten a ton of coverage where this is increasingly the case. But then we could also measure accuracy. So as I mentioned, we surveyed people on a range of things regarding climate change, but then we said, all right, now answer these questions the way you think your partner would answer them. And this is really interesting because then we can, people are accurate in the sense that they're better than just random guessing, but they're also quite off. People are overestimating their partner's beliefs in climate change. Some people are underestimating. And then lastly is this is a bit of a wonkier one, but I promise you it's an interesting one. So this is this idea of assumed similarity. So when I'm thinking about what my partner believes, I'm reflecting a little bit on what I myself believe. And so my best guess of what my partner believes is just what I believe. And this can be driving this accuracy or inaccuracy. And so when we put all this together, we find that about a third of couples that we sampled have one person that's like really worried about this issue and one that's kind of in the middle. We rarely found people that are like way, where one person thinks it's a hoax and one person is taking action. We haven't found much of that at all. But putting this together with the accuracy and assumed similarity data, we can start to find that a lot of the opportunity is right where we are already. And so my main takeaway for the study is that engaging with climate change starts at home. We're in the position to do that with our significant others and family members, depending on the family member and which holiday dinner table you're at. But in general, this is just a prime opportunity that we're leaving on the table with arguably the most important relationships we tend to have. So that's all for intervention points. Next, I want to move to some really big success stories. We've tested a range of different kinds of messages and messengers and different kinds of outcomes that we're looking at. So I'll just highlight a couple here. So one thing that I think is helpful is kind kind of scoping the possibilities when it comes to climate change communication. Like, how much can we possibly get out of our efforts? And then also, if we put ourselves in the toughest circumstances, could we still make progress? And so that's what I want to highlight in this first piece here, is that if we can change hearts and minds in the toughest circumstances, we can change hearts and minds much more in the best circumstances. So I want to introduce to you the New Climate Voices campaign. This is a campaign that, together with a range of incredible partners, that we helped run in the summer of 2019. And so we helped develop these professional level direct-to-camera videos, and we pre-tested a range of messengers, and the whole goal of this campaign was to convince Republicans in the US of the existence, causes, and harms of climate change. So we really wanted to engage them. And so we chose messengers that we suspected would be highly trusted and that would take in a very credible way and be really compelling. And so we went through a range of tests and we came up with these three messengers. So on the top, we have Katharine Hayhoe, one of my favorite climate messengers of all time. She's an evangelical Christian and climate scientist. So she has all the credibility in the world when it comes to the science, but she's also talking about her faith-based reasons for caring about climate change. Extremely compelling. I encourage you to look her up if you don't know her already. On the bottom left, we have General Ron Keyes, a retired Air Force military general, talking about the national security risks of climate change, how it's affecting the US military, and all sorts of compelling arguments like that. And on the bottom right, we have former Congressman Bob Inglis, who talks about how his conservative values make him care about climate change, and how that makes him really connected to the issue. And it's consistent with those values to take action on this issue. And so after we did this initial testing, we went into the field. So this is a field experiment, and so this is out in the real world, trying to convince real people, not people that are doing surveys all day long, which we also do plenty of that. But we are deploying this in 2 competitive congressional districts, again in the summer of 2019, 2nd District in Missouri and the 7th District in Georgia. And so this was a month-long campaign. And so the goal here was to target moderate conservatives and particularly Republicans in those 2 congressional districts. And we wanted to expose them as much as possible to this really high quality curated information about climate change. And so we ran that as much as we can across a range of different outlets, Facebook, YouTube, advertisements across the internet. And so we were able to reach about 87% of the target population, so really well reached there. But then we were able to reach an average of 7 completed video views per person, typically. And so a lot of exposure to this stuff over the course of a month. And so we were able to get independent samples of people within those populations in those congressional districts before and after the campaign. We had a parallel control group as well. And so let's just zoom in on the results a little bit here. And so first, focusing on the belief that climate change is happening, we see a 7 percentage point increase. Looking at the belief that climate change is human caused, we see a 10 percentage point increase. Looking at worry about climate change, one of the most important predictors that people are actually going to take action and find personal importance around this issue, we see a 13 percentage point increase. And then when we ask people about what their personal level of importance of this issue is, to them we see an 11-point increase. And then when we asked about the extent to which people think that climate change will cause personal harm, and there we see a 12-point increase. And then lastly, the percentage of people that think climate change will harm future generations, this is typically a lower bar, and we see a 16-point increase there. So really effective campaign. And just for someone who's participated in a ton of survey work here, we see some fluctuations of a few points each year. Things get kind of chaotic and they kind of level out. So increases of 10 percentage points are just really substantial here, especially over the course of just 1 month. And so this brings us to this idea of meeting people where they are. And so people are on different parts of this spectrum. Some people are ambivalent as to whether climate change is happening at all. Some people think it's happening, but they're unsure about what's causing it. A lot of people think it's natural causes, and so then there are people that believe it's happening, they believe it's human caused, but they don't think that we can do anything about it, so we got to motivate them to do something. Then there are people that they think it's happening human caused, they're worried about it, and they want to do something, but they don't know what to do. And so this is super important because this is one thing that we were talking about earlier is there are all these different questions where it seems like people don't, believe all the right things about climate change because they don't want to or because they're resisting it. And actually, there are studies like this that tell us more about if you get them, excellent information about this, they are willing to change, or at least a significant portion of them are. And so it's really encouraging. I just want to show a couple other success stories. We test a range of messages. And for the most part, things vary quite a bit, and it's really hard to predict how they vary. But it hammers home the importance of testing messages and catering them to those relevant contexts and outcomes that we care about. So one in particular, this is a personal, emotional story. So it's about this hunter and fisherman named Richard Mode, and he describes his personal experience with climate change. He expresses profound sadness and a sense of loss when talking about the effects of climate change, and how he's not seeing any more fish these days. He's seeing the landscape change right in front of his eyes. And so this is part of our national radio program called Yale Climate Connections. I encourage you to check it out. There's a bunch of amazing content there, but primarily the focus is on these 90-second radio stories. So you might have heard it if you're listening to the radio in the car these days. And so we do a range of tests alongside Yale Climate Connections, and this has been over many, many tests, this has been one of the most effective ones. And so just hearing this 90-second clip, and so testing is particularly with moderates and conservatives, we saw increases in climate change, beliefs that climate change is happening, human cause, worry about the issue, perceptions of risk to oneself and future generations, personal importance of the issue, and more. So really effective. But then there are other routes to changing hearts and minds on this. It's often in fashion these days to say things like facts don't matter or anything like that. I'm here to say that they do, and especially if they're done in a clear and compelling way. So one on this top right over here is this scientific consensus message. So 97% of climate scientists have concluded that human-caused global warming is happening. Even though trust in science has gone down a little bit over the years, scientists are still very widely trusted, among the highest across different entities that we measure, including government and corporations and beyond. And so this has again and again been a short, simple message that works quite well. And then there are other things where we did a bunch of tests on how do we increase support for renewable energy, because this is so central to solving the issue of climate change. And we tested a range of things. We try to cater it to people's values. We try to take an environmental angle for people that care about that. We try to take an economic angle for people who care about that. And those things do work around the edges, but the thing that worked the best was save some money. And so everyone cares about that, more or less. And so when we emphasize the cost savings of renewable energy, then people are more likely to support it, and they want to get solar panels on their roof and so on. And so the main takeaway here through many, many experiments is that there are many routes to success. And so there's no magic sauce, there's no one message to rule them all. I feel like we've been chasing our tail on that a little bit as a field. And so the key thing here is that the way I'd summarize it is that many different things matter a little bit. It's kind of like what makes a good film or good art. It's like kind of slippery as to what makes it good, but it's just lots of little things that matter. And so I think that's what makes a good message. And this is why we again and again find that when we add this ingredient or subtract out this other ingredient, we can improve messaging a bit, but a lot of it's this collection of things. So the New Climate Voices campaign is a good example where we really fine-tuned it and got it just right. And so this good summary is that there are many routes to success here. All right. So now onto this last piece of the talk. I want to zoom out a little bit and think about how we're thinking about this on a mass scale. And so when we add a strategic angle to this, we need to focus on managing trade-offs. So we only have, as you know, recalling the earlier part of the talk, is that we have limited time and resources, and we have to choose wisely as to which outcomes to care about, which kinds of tactics to try. And so there are lots of things we can change, but it's important to focus on whether that's the best thing for us to focus on. And so this is pulling from a strategic framework that Abel and I developed. And so this is getting at the main idea of it. So one thing, and so applying this specifically to climate change and reducing emissions in particular, is that there's only so much we can change a behavior. So you could imagine a spectrum of like how changeable a behavior is and how much we can influence that with messaging and so on. And then those behaviors are associated with different carbon impacts. And so looking at all these different field interventions, last year together with a few colleagues, we published a paper looking at all the studies in the literature that we could find, 430 field experiments that have attempted all sorts of different interventions. So do we like pay people to save energy? Do we, use social norms and say what their neighbors are expecting of them? Which outcomes do we focus on? Is it recycling? Is it biking instead of driving? What is it? And so we put all these together and we did a second order meta-analysis, or it's a meta-analysis. So a little Inception vibes there. And so we categorize all these different studies into these categories. So you have the different kinds of interventions on the left, and then the different kinds of outcomes on the right. And so just to get into these just for a moment, so social norms, this is leveraging what other people believe or what they expect of you. Like the main reason why I mow my lawn is because I'm just a little bit worried about the expectations of my neighbors. And that is one of the biggest contributions of social psychology, is that we care a lot about what other people think. Financial incentive is pretty straightforward. You pay people to do stuff, or you incentivize them with tax breaks or some other things like that. Feedback, you can tell people how they're doing. So this has gotten more popular over the years, where you can send people like, here's your energy bill, here's where you're at, and putting that in more intuitive terms. Commitment, getting people to take pledges. I'm sure many of us have been the target of these kinds of things. At basic education, so this is more of the traditional, like, here are the facts, you decide for yourself what to do. Appeals are things that focus on people's values and motivations and trying to cater to those in messaging. And the outcome, there are a range of these. Some get disproportionate focus, and some have varying connection to climate change and the environment. So like littering, as an example, has been really popular as a subject of intervention. And so the reason why I want to lay these out here is because I want to illustrate a little bit how we're thinking about this in a strategic way. And so overall, looking across all these 430 studies, we find that social norms and financial incentives have the largest effect by a pretty clear margin. And that the easiest to change, so the biggest effects on particular outcomes were on littering and recycling. And one of the hardest to change was transportation behavior. So getting someone to take public transit instead of drive, or a bike instead of drive, or to fly less. There are a range of these studies. And so back to this idea of managing trade-offs, we have how changeable the behavior is, and then how impactful is that change on carbon emissions. And so how changeable that behavior is, our meta-analysis found that it's way easier to get someone to recycle than to get them to change their transportation behavior. But when we look at the impact, changing your transportation behavior is a way bigger deal in its effect on climate change than recycling. In fact, we've really overemphasized recycling here. I think we should still do it, don't get me wrong, but the amount of focus is really disproportionate. And so when we put these things together, it really focuses us on really focusing on the big stuff. And so a lot of questions I get is like, do I use these kinds of plastic bags or this detergent? And believe me, I'm a happy customer of a lot of those products, but we really should just be focusing more on the big stuff. And so when you're speaking to others about this, it's really focusing on those things that have a really significant impact. I can't even do the math to like how much recycling would add up to biking instead of driving. It's just no comparison. And so that's a good way to think about this trade-off is like our focus on these things should be proportional to their impact. And that's an important takeaway. All right, so putting this all together. So I started with identifying intervention points, and the key here is finding where our efforts are needed most and where we're leaving, progress on the table. So I talked about how, there are lots of people who haven't even heard of this issue around the world. Some of our earlier estimates is that more than 1 billion people have not heard of this issue, or they've barely come in contact with it. And so a lot of this is just making the connection to begin with. We don't have to get too complicated. We just have to get it to them. And then building on this, when I highlighted that even people that are really worried about this issue, they rarely or never discuss it with others. So that's something that we have to change. And one major part of that is learning that many of us care about it. And so often we're failing to recognize that, or we're underestimating that. And then the last piece around intervention points is that the best place to start to have climate conversations is with loved ones. And so don't be shy in doing that there. And then success stories, the big take home there is that people are persuadable. There are often going through daily life, it feels like, we're not making any progress or feel like we're talking to a wall sometimes. But there's such a big difference between progress in the aggregate and one-to-one conversation. And so often we change lots of people's views, but a little bit. And that adds up to a lot. So if you're talking to someone who, they say climate change is a natural phenomenon and our activities have nothing to do with it, you could nudge them a little bit away from that. And that would be a success. And so when we think about 10 percentage point differences, I'd consider that really substantial. But you could imagine being successful 1 out of every 10 conversation. It feels like you're failing, but you're really not. And then second piece to success stories is that there are so many different routes to successfully engaging with people. There's no silver bullet, and I don't think we're headed towards one. And so in thinking about all these routes, a lot of the people we interact with, they're focused on the big stuff, paying their bills, their personal health, the health and well-being of their loved ones. We can speak to those and be pretty successful there. We don't have to get too complicated. We don't have to really bend into all these different arguments. There are a lot of these routes to success. And then changing hearts and minds on a mass scale, lastly. So limited time and resources means we must manage trade-offs. And this again brings us back to focusing on the big stuff. And so we have to focus on these high impact behaviors because even if they're really hard to change, that probably still amounts to a much larger impact on climate change than getting many more people to recycle or to change their light bulbs. Important stuff, but not nearly as important as the other stuff. And so I just want to say thank you to the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication team, the Yale Climate Connections team. Some incredible people make this work happen. Our incredible students, our wonderful funders, without which this work would not be possible, and to Pews for inviting me, and to Abel, and to you all. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks so much. That's a great fodder for conversation here as we enter some Q&A. So I believe we'll have a mic in the center aisle here. If there are things that are on your mind, questions you have specifically about the talk or in general about climate change, how people think and act on the environment, or research around this that you've heard, feel free to step up to the mic, or if you're in reach of this cable, I can get to you where you are. Yeah, feel free to bring anything to light that you'd like to discuss.
Yeah.
That's great.
Thank you.
Try it. Okay.
There you go.
So, wonderful talk.
Thank you.
So leaning into your message, give us more on how to go about treating hearts and minds and action on the hard stuff. Because some of the strategies you've been using seem to be helpful, just talk about transportation. You think?
Yeah. And this is especially tough being a social scientist to say that a lot of the barriers are not necessarily social. So we were talking about this a while earlier in our discussion that, if you're trying to get people to, take their bike to work instead of their car, but the path there is totally dangerous with no bike lanes, there's no amount of messaging that's going to change that. And so a lot of this is structural. We think about do I get an EV? Where do I charge it? Some of that just is big policy stuff that we must get done. But then together, if we create those bike lanes, people aren't going to automatically get on their bike. So that's where some of our efforts come together. And I think, like I've been saying, focusing on the big stuff, making it fun. So in New Haven, where I live, they just rolled out an e-bike program, and I'm like, this is awesome, and especially because it's hilly, a lot of people don't want to get on their bikes. And so we have to overcome those barriers and make it fun, make it normative. So other people are doing it, and that's a big thing there too, where it takes a little while for something to get going and to become normative. So that there are these two layers to norms where other people are doing it, but then other people approve of it and like it. And so especially when that behavior is visible, that's really important. And we've seen this with some of our colleagues at the School of the Environment, where you see the spread of solar panels across neighborhoods because it's a very visible thing. And so neighbors get to talking, and then you start to see it spread through networks. And so not bringing particular messaging advice there, except focus on the big stuff, but not all of it is social.
Next, I'm Cincinnati. Great. I have a question regarding, I don't know what the term is in advertising, communication, messaging. It has to do with frequency, has to do with the interval between the messages.
Yeah.
And, well, there's two factors. First of all, tell me what that term is, I'm just curious to know. But I wonder if you can address that regarding messaging on any of these scales, either personal one or a greater thing, like the campaign you had in Missouri and Georgia, campaigns in Missouri and Georgia. And in a sense, it takes more than one exposure, one time. Maybe, and what is the interval? Once a week, once a day, once a year? How many times until something gets through? So.
Yeah, a really good question. The short answer is we don't know, but we have focused a bit on durability. So that's one piece of it where, well, you convince these people, does that even last by the time they go about their lives in the next day? 2 weeks. But then the other half kind of sticks around for at least a month, where we're stretching that to 2 months, and we're continuing to track that. And the other piece that you mentioned is actually a study we're planning now. We're calling it durability and dosage. So how long do things last, but then how much do you space them out, and then how much does repetition count? In general, I'd say hearing things more than once should help. But in particular, if you're getting new information from it. And so you're not just activating things that are already in people's minds, you're actually introducing new pieces to it. And so there, the jury's still out as to what specific things stick the best and how often there. But there's some work showing that that these things do add up a little bit. It's not clear what the exact curve is, like when there's diminishing returns. We have some friends and colleagues that are doing this kind of work through advertising. And so it's interesting. When I'm not sure we're there yet, but one thing that I'm aspiring to with our work is to understand that trade-off between mass reach, where you're moving lots of people a little bit and you got to hit them a lot of times with the message, versus you have a face-to-face conversation with them and they move quite a bit and it's meaningful and durable. That's really hard to do with millions of people. So jury's still out mostly, but it's a super important question.
how it's often these bigger things that we're trying to change often are the hardest. And when you were kind of talking about social norms, I keep wondering how much of that is actually mediated, though, by something like education. So I'll give you an example. I do a lot of research in Sweden around the environment. And they have this thing called plane shaming. You don't get on an airplane, that you use, like everything is public transport as much as humanly possible. And a lot of that seems to be that it's both a cultural norm, but they also start educating them about climate change at a very early age. And so to me, it's always seemed like education was the biggest component to actually making people start to have drastic changes in policy. And so I'm just wondering kind of what you're thinking about in terms of what are the potential mediating effects for these social norms in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I think education is such a big role there. And I think the thing that we grapple with there is our time horizon. So like we measure in our surveys people's support for climate change being integrated into just like the general curriculum. And a lot of people do support that, but that's a longer time horizon because if you're teaching kids, it's going to take a while before all of that seeps in and they become voters and active citizens. And so I think that's definitely worth our while. We need to also play the long game. Like we need action now, but we can't be short-sighted and only focus on the moment. And so I think education plays a huge role there. What leads people to develop that norm? I think people being more visible in their concern, I think is a big one. So back to that, that divide between like people are worried, they're not really talking about it. So I think a part of that is speak up. There isn't as big of a social risk as you think. And it takes time. And so I think this also depends a lot on the particular group that you're in. But speaking up and then together with things like education, hearing about it more. Unfortunately, there are lots of terrible events that make it top of mind now. And so we're thinking about these events as teachable moments. And so are there particular windows of opportunity, like when after a hurricane hits or something like that, where we're able to say like, all right, here's like the perfect time to educate people on this. And so there's still a lot of work to do there, but some of the work we're doing is focusing on that, like advertising explainers, critical moments during election season, stuff like that. So I think it's this collection of things that build a norm, and then norms take a little while to develop. Often we're looking at the immediate time point, so we're failing to see like the aggregate effects. And so I think that's the frontier of our work.
Dr. Goldberg, thanks for being here and sharing your ideas. I'm interested if you were to maybe give some of your own opinions on where messaging needs to be targeted today. You talked a little bit about recycling, which is all of us will play a part in that. But when you look at the major contributors to carbon emissions, if you were to able to move the needle with the top 50 companies, top 50 emitters, as well as largest governments, top 3 governments in the world, if you just were able to move that particular body, you would see significant impact at scale.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if you have an opinion on, is that the right group to target, or are they motivated by the general population? And that's why we need to have all of us informed and moving in that direction. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, really good question. This is a tough one because it relies on like, does democracy work? And I'm not fully sure. It highly depends on where you are because there's a lot of work in political science showing like, well, actually public opinion doesn't matter so much. It's actually the opinions of the elites. That evidence is pretty mixed. So it depends. We're kind of hedging our bets a little bit. So we're starting to do some work on messaging directly to elites. And part of that is that elites have this same problem of pluralistic ignorance. So there's been survey work showing that lawmakers often underestimate how pro-climate their constituents are. And so how could they act on that if they don't have an accurate view of what's happening? And so we're doing some experimentation there. And I think there's a tension there because a democracy should function based on the views of their citizens, and the U.S. kind of has a mixed record on that. Depends where else you go there. But then there's a normative impact of a big country taking action. And so there have been great examples on this, whether it's legalizing cannabis or legalizing same-sex marriage and stuff like that, where we have changed dramatically as a country, relatively short time. And so the normative effects of a Supreme Court decision or a government taking action are potentially huge. And so especially if the US is acting like a leader on the global stage, then that should have an impact. And so I think we've mostly, over the years, we've put a significant amount into engaging with conservatives because I personally don't see a path to significant and durable action without conservatives really being on board and then it being okay publicly. Like I speak to some conservatives now where they're like, yeah, I care about climate change, but it's kind of a secret. And that's tough because sometimes they have good reason to be worried because actually legislators are way out of step with regular Republicans, like everyday Republicans. And so that tension is very real. And so I think tying this back in with norms, I think there is a huge public opinion part of it, especially when it comes to like statewide ballot initiatives and stuff like that. And then in other cases, we just got to convince like the CEO of this company to cave to the pressure of their consumers. So I think it's a both and, but I think adding both efforts of like general public matters, but they're not the only constituency that matters.
Graph that you had that showed how many people believe that climate change is mostly human caused, the numbers were pretty low in my opinion. So I was wondering if your surveys, do you get like long form answers? Do you know what's going through people's minds? What do they think is causing climate change?
Yeah, we've done some of this where we give an open response option. And so usually this closed-end question is, sometimes it's just a binary or a few choices. In other cases, it's a spectrum where it's like, do you think it's like entirely human activities versus entirely natural or some combination of both? The open responses get pretty interesting answers. Some people say it's God. Some people say, yeah, like it's natural, but with some human influence. Some people say like it's volcanoes or the sun. And so it's really tough. And we've done some messaging on like, how do we talk about the causes directly? And we've done a combination of just like educational styles, debunking of like, here's how we know it's not the sun. Here's how we know it's not volcanoes. A lot of these work decently well. And so it depends. I think the big one is the biggest sticking point that is just natural. And I think it's just, it's an easy thing to envision where it's like, oh, it's been this warm before. Because you could imagine hot days when you grew up or whatever. And so that's easy to distort psychologically. So that's my hypothesis. But I think, yeah, the biggest one is that it's just natural. This is just a regular cycle, and then we're going to have an ice age again. It's pretty varied, but that's a big one.
I have a question. On your map, you showed that the United States is higher than many other countries regarding information on climate change. And for countries such as the US that has so many people from so many different cultures, how do we push for climate change for those that may not have the information or do not share the same beliefs? Just because of what your map showed, they don't have the same information on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so sometimes that's infrastructure. So like one thing we focus on in India is that so some of our national representative surveys are actually getting people through like that actually don't have internet access. So if you don't have internet access, you should, like it's just hard to have a view on it because you're just not really hearing about this issue. So some of that is just like, getting access to electricity, getting internet access, and just like having that information at your fingertips. Whether there are cultural reasons to argue that you should care about climate change, that's definitely an important one. We do see when we test things across countries that effects do vary quite a bit. Sometimes you want to take more of a faith-based approach. In other cases, there are cultural truisms that you could play into there. I'd say I still come away with the same message that some of the basics are still pretty enduring. So I'd say it varies, but it takes a deep dive research into the structural problems or limitations of that country, and then just getting at least good messaging to them. And then we can tinker around the edges if we want to make them a little bit more effective, but it won't be make or break typically.
I have actually a follow-up on that. I'm just curious to see the knowledge indices, best places on this country like India, where your data show that there is net sort of low levels of knowledge, right? And like you said, some of that might be discussed. How much of that, though, do you think is relevant to what you would call changeability of behavior? I mean, so somebody might not know, a farmer in India might not know what climate change is, or they don't talk about it to their friends, but they're watching these seasonal climatic changes play out in real time in ways that are not there in the US. Right?
Totally.
And so as someone who works in global health, we've seen this script where you say the global south doesn't have information, they need tech transfer. But their insights and their experiences are actually sometimes more urgent than how we experience in the global north. So I wonder how in this moment is knowledge the only sort of mover for climate action, or are there other ways that we should to measure or observe how likely someone is going to talk about the way it sort of affects them?
Yeah, really important question. And yeah, this is a great point about India, because when we first say, like, what do you think about climate change? We get a lot of people that are like, I'm not sure. But then when you give them a little description and you describe, some connecting the dots, we see like a huge jump, particularly in India, because as you say, like, they're picking up on it. And so when we ask about, like, has the weather changed? Have you been harmed by significant extreme weather events? People are definitely picking up on that. And it's been interesting because there's been a growing literature on how much personal experience drives these beliefs about climate change. And it's kind of been mixed, where you have your own beliefs and then you look at the world through those beliefs. So if you really don't care about this issue, you look around and you're like, well, there have always been hurricanes. But then there are a lot of people that learn through experience where they're like, oh, I see that it's getting worse. And that's obvious. And so I think there's noise around the signal, but people are picking up on the signal. And so often, especially in places like India, where we like briefly connect the dots and they're like on top of it. And so a lot of the time it's just getting that information to them. And so, but in the US, it's a much different scenario where knowledge actually, among some groups, can be a negative predictor, because you think you know a lot if you've listened to lots of climate change is a hoax kind of messaging. And so but the US is actually more the exception rather than the rule. Because I remember when I first started this work, I was heavily focused just on the US, and I was like, conservatives just don't care about this. And then you look abroad, there are plenty of conservatives that are just as concerned as the liberals are, even though conservatism and liberalism mean different things in different places. But like in India, we look for political differences and they're essentially zero, or they're more or less even. And that's just such a shocker, having focused on the US, because this divide is so huge here. And so I think I feel more encouraged when we do our international work, where people are connecting the dots, and there are barriers, but they're just different ones than we see here. Yeah, thank you.
So I was really curious about not only the videos of conservatives kind of urging people to take things into consideration, but also in the personal stories like the hunter fisherman that we talked about. Were there any sort of gender disparities in which ones of these stories got listened to and watched all the way through versus the ones that people clicked away from after a few seconds?
Yeah, absolutely. So there has been a bit of work on gender differences in climate beliefs, as well as just other risks. And in general, women tend to be more sensitive to risks than men are. And we see this across lots of different kinds of risks. And it's not obvious why. There are some competing explanations. But then outside the US, you start to see things flip where there are large gender differences in education access, for example, in which case you see women saying, more likely to say they don't know or they don't have an opinion. So it is context dependent. And and we've looked at a bunch of like messaging effects. And again, women tend to respond a little bit more. I don't want to make too much out of it because it's kind of inconsistent. But in general, if I'm placing a bet, I think women are going to be more responsive. And we see that across issues, not just climate.
All right, we're reaching towards the end of our time here. I wanted to follow up with one last question. You've talked a lot about messaging and message effects, and oftentimes I feel like our field is very focused on tinkering with messages and wording and trying to find the magic bullet. And so I'm wondering if you can zoom out a little for a moment and think about what are the many other things that might influence the success or failure of communication efforts generally, beyond just tinkering with the content of a message.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Abel's got the inside info because we've talked about this a ton, where we get a little bit of frustration where it's like all of climate communication is not like the words we use and the kinds of emotions that are in the message. Like that matters a lot. But the raw signal of like, are you even hearing about this? And is the stuff you're hearing any good? So that I'd say is one of the biggest things. Another one is your information environment, if there's any opposing messages. And so often we find that if you give people, competing messages, they tend to cancel out. And there's some work trying to get at, like, how do you make that more durable such that when they get misinformation, they're not as persuaded? But then another one, back to norms, is like, what are people around you saying, and what's your access to them? And so often when we're in an environment where everyone believes the same thing that we do, they're not really moving us around because we already are in line. And so when you enter a new environment where the people around you are more pro-climate, then we can start to see that level of concern go up. And then the other thing is back to personal experience. We are starting to pick up more on that signal where someone's home is destroyed in a hurricane and they're like, this is we've seen too many of these already. They're happening more frequently, and when they do, they're worse. And so it's a combination of this personal experience, how people are responding to it, and whether that there's an information vacuum or whether there's actually good information as part of the equation. So all those things are operating regardless of like what the specific contents of the messages are. That stuff does matter, but this other stuff of just like the signal of it just carries so much weight.
All right, thank you so much. If you could join me one more time in thanking Dr. Goldberg for his time. It's a wonderful discussion. We'll be up here if you want to say hi to Dr. Goldberg and have any questions afterwards. But again, thank you for joining us, and there is more refreshments on your way out if you'd like to grab a little snack. Again, thanks again, and thanks to Pews and the rest of our co-sponsors today. I did not. Yeah, I realized that halfway through. I had to get to the good stuff. Yeah.
Mike.